Hi, Founder fans. Jason here. Welcome to a Federalist read-along. As you may be aware, but if this is your first time, you're not. These are live read-alongs of the Federalist Papers. We go line by line through the Federalist Papers to see if we can't dissect that 18th century language and learn a little bit more about what the American founders were discussing at the time when they were promoting the United States Constitution. Excuse me. I'm just going to pull one thing up very quickly because as I'm discussing, as I was pulling up, I realized I did not set everything up quite. There's always something when you're setting these up. It is okay. Federalist number 30. So if you want to read along, you can click the link in the description below. What I had forgotten to do was to activate that link. Hi, Nick. Thank you so much for coming. Let's see if I've corrected that. I think I did. Hit enter. And we are very good to go. So, with that out of the way, let's get to the American Revolution. Now, I'm going to pull up this screen, and we're going to notice right away that it is not connected. Oh, it is. Okay, well, at least one problem's resolved. Thank you for your patience. Welcome to Federalist number 30, as it says down below. Concerning the general power of taxation, written for the New York Packet on December 28th, 1787 by Alexander Hamilton. Now, I do want to note, as we said last week, we're jumping back in time. The number 29 is actually written later in January, but when they published the book, since it was regarding the militia and Hamilton had been discussing the army at large, when they actually published their book in the following March, that's when they get their numbers. And therefore, that's when they decide to bump one published in January up to number 29. So we're jumping back in time to December, just after Christmas, 1787. This is a little bit of a longer one, and we are leaving behind all that talk about standing armies and the Navy and such, and we are moving on to, as it says above, right next to me, the general power of taxation. So without further ado, why don't we read a little bit about taxation? As always, it's to the people of the state of New York. And let's see what Hammy has to say on this one. It has been already observed that the federal government ought to possess the power of providing for the support of the national forces, in which proposition was intended to be included the expense of raising troops, of building and equipping fleets, and all other expenses in any wise connected with military arrangements and operations. So, simply referencing his previous articles, we've been discussing about the need for these forces. Now that you agree with me, there's a lot of alliteration here. Possess the power of providing support. That was tough. Anyway, he's just kind of recapping and moving right along. But these are not the only objects to which the jurisdiction of the Union, in respect to revenue, must necessarily be empowered to extend. So, we do need to raise money for the military and the armed forces, but that's not all we need money for. It must embrace a provision for the support of the national civil list, for the payment of the national debts contracted, or that may be contracted, and, in general, for all those matters which will call for disbursements out of the national treasury. So, he's listing a few other things which raising revenue is very important. National civil list, aka putting together a census, payment of national debts that they accrued during the Revolutionary War, and after creating the government, they might accrue in the future, which Hamilton will himself do, and for all other matters that are not here enlisted. The conclusion is that there must be interwoven in the frame of the government a general power taxation in one shape or another. So we have to collect taxes somehow. Money is, with propriety, considered as the vital principle of the body politic, as that which sustains its life and motion and enables it to perform its most essential functions. So money is the root of literally everything. A complete power, therefore, to procure a regular and adequate supply of it, as far as the resources of the community will permit, may be regarded as an indispensable ingredient in every constitution. So every government needs a way to raise money. From a deficiency in this particular, one of two evils must ensue. Either the people must be subjected to continual plunder as a substitute for a more eligible mode of supplying the public wants, or the government must sink into a fatal atrophy and, in a short course of time, perish. So, if there is no way for a government to raise money, it's either going to just steal money from the citizens themselves, or not have enough money and eventually just not work anymore. Going to get a little history lesson here. In the Ottoman or Turkish Empire, the sovereign, though in other respects absolute master of the lives and fortunes of his subjects, has no right to impose a new tax. So over in Turkey, under the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan, I believe it was called, had the ability to do everything, but couldn't actually raise taxes. But he was really a monarchy in the old-fashioned sense of the word. The consequence is that he permits the bashaws, or governors of the provinces, to pillage the people without mercy, and in turn squeeze out of them the sums which he stands in need, to satisfy his own exigencies and those of the state. Anyone who's watching for the first time, or people who've been watching a long time, know I can't pronounce this word, and I don't know why. But the moral of the entire sentence is that the essentially governors of the separate states within the Ottoman Empire, they were allowed to just take all the money from the people they desired. They can raise whatever taxes they wanted, and it was not good for the people themselves. In America, from a like cause, the government of the Union has gradually dwindled into a state of decay, approaching nearly annihilation. So the states themselves are allowed to take money from the people, but it's an interesting comparison how he's saying that under the Articles of Confederation that they didn't. Okay, so the Articles of Confederation, much like the leader of the Ottoman Empire, could not raise taxes themselves, but the states were allowed to raise taxes, and they would take just whatever they wanted from the people. It's interesting. I suppose he's in a fashion referencing to the rebellions like Shays' Rebellion and such, where the people didn't have the money to pay, but it's not, that wasn't really, I guess it was through taxation because they couldn't pay their mortgages. Interesting comparison. It's a stretch. Who can doubt that the happiness of the people in both countries would be promoted by competent authorities in the proper hands to provide the revenues which the necessities of the public might require? So, wouldn't it be better if there was one government that was able to raise taxes and do it right? Excuse me. The present Confederation, feeble as it is intended to repose in the United States, and in limited power of providing for the pecuniary wants of the Union. So, the Continental Congress, he's saying here, is supposed to be able to provide for the whole Union, but it doesn't have the power to do. It's not really what it was intended for. Let's let him elaborate here. But the proceeding upon an erroneous principle, it has been done in such a manner as entirely to have frustrated the intention. So Hamilton's understanding of the Articles of Confederation and the Continental Congress is to provide for the Union, but it was set up incorrectly and therefore cannot do it. The cannot do it part is right. I'm not entirely in agreement that that was the purpose of the Articles of Confederation. Congress, by the articles which compose that compact, as has already been stated, are authorized to ascertain and call for any sums of money necessary, in their judgment, to the service of the United States, and their requisitions, if conformable to the rule of apportionment, are in every constitutional sense obligatory upon the states. So, to translate that sentence, the Articles of Confederation was allowed to raise whatever money it wanted to, which is true, and request it from the states based on apportionment, based on the size of the different states. So, that is true, but in their judgment, to the services of the United States, that's not wrong, but the Articles of Confederation was never really meant to serve the individual states. It was supposed to serve as it it literally says in the first sentence, a firm league of friendship. So mostly for mutual defense and for funding ambassadors overseas. These have no right to question the property of demand, no discretion beyond that of devising the ways and means of furnishing the sums demanded. So they can demand all this money, but they have no way to collect that money, which also is true. A little bit of a long sentence here. But though this be strictly and truly the case, though the assumption of such a right would be an infringement of the Articles of Union, though it may seldom or never have been avowedly claimed, yet in practice it has been constantly exercised, and will continue to be so, as long as the revenues of the Confederacy should remain dependent on the intermediate agency of its members. So, he's saying, strictly and truly, technically this is how things work, though assumption of a right would be infringement of the Articles. So, the Articles don't say this outright, but theoretically this is how it's supposed to work. But this is what they do request the money constantly, and they have no way to practice it. A very interesting back way to say, essentially, that the Articles don't say what they raise money for, how much they can raise, or anything like that, or how they can collect it. Yeah, very interesting sentence. It just depends. What's true here is that it depends on the generosity of the members, as we've discussed in this series time and time again. What the consequences of this system have been is within the knowledge of every man the least conversant in our public affairs, and has been amply unfolded in different parts of these inquiries. So everyone knows what the problems are with the Articles of Confederation. We've already talked about it here. It is this which has chiefly contributed to reduce us to a situation which affords ample causes both of mortification to ourselves and triumph to our enemies. So everyone's aware, we've already talked about why the problems with raising money under the Articles of Confederation is an embarrassment to the people and making us weaker. And he's going to ask himself some questions, as he likes to do. What remedy can there be for this situation, but in a change of the system which has produced in it a change of the fallacious and delusive system of quotas and requisitions? So what can we do to fix the problem other than to get rid of the system we currently have? What substitute can be imagined for this ignis fatuus in finance, but that of permitting the national government to raise its own revenues by the ordinary methods of taxation authorized in every well-ordered constitution of civil government? So, what better way to fix this problem than, instead of asking please give us money states, just simply letting the federal government tax the people? Ingenious men may declaim with plausibility on any subject, but no human ingenuity can point out any other expedient to rescue us from the inconveniences and embarrassments naturally resulting from defective supplies of the public treasury. So, really smart anti-federalists can give you plausible ideas of why this is a bad idea, but no one can say, hey, look, the Articles of Confederation are doing a good job raising money, and we should keep it this way. Which also was kind of true. The more intelligent adversaries of the new Constitution admit the force of this reasoning, but they qualify their admission by a distinction between what they call internal and external taxation. His capital is not mine. Now, this is very important. The Anti-Federalists would go out and say there is a difference between taxing things being imported to the United States, imposts, and things that we own here. What he's calling internal taxation. Let him elaborate for a second before I do. The former, they would reserve to the state governments. The latter, which they explain into commercial imposts, or rather, duties on imported articles, they declare themselves willing to concede to the federal head. So as I was saying just before, internal taxes, property taxes, income taxes, sales taxes, they're not against these taxes, the Anti-Federalists, but they want the states to collect those taxes. However, as far as imports go, that they are willing to say, okay, we can use this as a way for the federal government, or the Anti-Federalists wanted the Continental Congress to raise money. Even when Great Britain they were part of the mighty empire of Great Britain, the colonists were not upset on import taxes. They understood that to ship things from around the world cost money, and that was a good way to collect taxes. They were upset about taxes within. They didn't like the Stamp Act because the books were being printed, not the books, but many papers being printed in the United States. You were taxing internal activities, legal documents, things of that nature. That they did not like. But import taxes, imposts as they're called, that was never really a problem. So therefore the Anti-Federalists were willing to allow that to happen. The Anti-Federalists did understand there were problems with the Articles of Confederation and did want to correct it. And that was one of the ways they thought they could. One of the ways they could correct the Articles of Confederation was, instead of having money come from the states by request, they could have the money come from import duties. Now, let's let Hamilton continue. This distinction, however, would violate the maxim of good sense and sound policy, which dictates that every power ought to be in proportion to its object, and would still leave the general government in a kind of tutelage to the state governments, inconsistent with every idea of vigor or efficiency. Again, these are his capitals, not mine. Essentially, every government should, or every policy, he's saying here, have power in proportion to its object. So what you want to get done, the government needs to have the power to do. And the only way for the government to have a power to even collect the imposts or the import taxes, there needs to be improvement. You at least need to improve on the Articles of Confederation. More questions for himself. Who can pretend that commercial imposts are or would be alone equal to the present and future agencies of the Union? Again, the one word I will never be able to pronounce, agencies. Who can pretend that the commercial imposts would be alone equal to the present and future agencies of the United States? Or who could possibly imagine that the United States can raise enough money to fund itself simply on imports? At the time, there was a lot going on then, a lot being produced in the United States, and a lot more expected on the way. Again, we're on the eve of the Industrial Revolution as this is being written, and they knew that. People were already filing patents for steamboats, to put a perspective on it. Taking into the account the existing debt, foreign and domestic, upon any plan of extinguishment which a man moderately impressed with the importance of public justice and public credit could approve, in addition to the establishments which all parties will acknowledge to be necessary, we could not reasonably flatter ourselves that this resource alone, upon the most improved scale, would even suffice for its present necessities. So he's saying, Anti-Federalists, I see what you're coming from, but that's not nearly enough money to pay for the entirety of the Union. To which most Anti-Federalists would say, we don't want to pay for the entirety of the Union, but that's a different conversation. Its future necessities admit not of calculation or limitation, and upon the principle more than once adverted to, the power of making provision for them as they arise ought to be equally unconfined. Let me read that again. I read it a little bit wrong. Again, 18th century language, difficult for everyone. Give me a break. Its future necessities admit not of calculation or limitation, and upon the principle more than once adverted to, the power of making provision for them as they arise ought to be equally unconfined. So essentially, as issues come about, as things we need to pay for suddenly appear, we can't necessarily predict what we might need to pay for in the future, but when those things arise, we need to have an ability to pay for. And therefore, if the imposts aren't enough money for us to pay, we need to find other ways to raise money through taxation. Okay, his capital is not mine. I believe it may be regarded as a position warranted by the history of mankind that, in the usual progress of things, the necessities of a nation, in every stage of its existence, will be found at least equal to its resources. So, what a nation always needs will be found at least it's equal to its resources. So here I believe he's using the word resources as its money, its financial ability. So every nation will need at least as much as it will be able to pay for. Interesting. So you'll always need more money. Again, Hamilton would very shortly after this be promoting national debt, which is a very complicated thing to go about. I'm not going to get too into it now. Hamilton, like him or not, was like his policies or not, he was a financial genius. One of the things that made Albert Gallatin, Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of Treasury, so important is that he was one of the few founders who could actually understand what Hamilton was talking about when he spoke about finances. And Hamilton would very shortly after want to bring about a national debt, which I know on first thinking it sounds like, oh, okay, you take out money and you have to pay it back. But a national debt is really essentially like a credit score. Like if you take out a credit card and you keep paying it off every month, you build better credit. And that's essentially what he wanted to do with that. And that's why when he's saying at least is equal to its resources, he really means you need more than what you have. And that's why later on he'd be all about the national debt. And I'm not an economist, and that's a very brief overview. Thank you for your patience. I am not a financial genius with Alexander Hamilton. It's what makes studying his financial plan so difficult for students of history is we're not all necessarily mathematicians. Continuing. Excuse me. Let me take a quick sip. All this talking. To say that deficiencies may be provided for by requisitions upon the states is, on the one hand, to acknowledge that this system cannot be depended on, and on the other hand, to depend upon it for everything beyond a certain limit. So to say that deficiencies may be provided for by requisitions on the states, it's to acknowledge that this system cannot be... Oh, okay. So keeping up the current system of the Articles of Confederation, where we're asking for the states to please give us money, you're both acknowledging that the Articles of Confederation itself can't be depended on, because it is itself dependent on all these separate states. And at the same time, it has to, on the other hand, it has to be, but at the same time, we also have to depend on it for everything, especially military and foreign affairs. Excuse me. Those who have carefully attended to its vices and deformities as they have been exhibited by experience or delineate in the course of these papers must feel invincible repugnancy to trusting the national interest in any degree to its operation. Excuse me. If you really look at the Articles, what he's saying here, if you look at the Articles of Confederation, you can see how problematic it is. Its inevitable tendency, wherever it is brought into activity, must be to enfeeble the Union, and sow the seeds of discord and contention between the federal head and its members, and between the members themselves. Again, he's referencing it as a federal head. The Anti-Federalists would say it's not a federal government, but the problems with the Articles of Confederation, he's saying, are sowing the seeds of discord, or AKA driving the states apart. Can it be expected that the deficiencies would be better supplied in this mode than the total wants of the Union have heretofore been supplied in the same mode? So, again, another question for you. He's asking the problems with the Articles of Confederation. Would it be better if we used a different method? AKA the Constitution. It ought to be recollected that if less will be required from the states, they will have proportionally less means to answer the demand. If less be required from the states, so if we don't need as much from the individual states, they will have less means to answer the demand. I'm a little confused as to where he's going with this. It sounds to me like he's saying if the states don't need to pay as much money to the federal government, then they will have less money in general. It ought to be recollected that if less will be required from the states, they will have proportionate... So if the Articles of Confederation ask for less from the states, they will have less money to do what they want. So if the Articles of Continental Congress under the Articles is saying, hey, we need some money, we need a lot of it, they're not going to get it. but if they ask, hey, we need a little bit of money, they might get it, but then they won't have enough. Got it. Sorry, it took me a second to uncork that one. It's 18th century language. It's tricky. That's why we're doing this. If the opinions of those who contend for the distinction which has been mentioned were to be received as evidence of truth, one would be led to conclude that there was some known point in the economy of national affairs at which it would be safe to stop and say, thus far the ends of public happiness will be promoted by supplying the wants of government, and all beyond this is unworthy of our care and anxiety. So, big sentence there. What he's getting at is, if you agree with what Hamilton has said to this point, then you have to reflect and say that there's a limit on what the government needs. Thus far, the ends of public happiness will be promoted by supplying the wants of government. So the general public will be happier, the nation will run better, if everything the government needs, it can afford. And everything beyond this is unworthy of anxiety. So anything else doesn't matter. Don't sweat it, as long as the government can afford what it needs to do. Some more questions for us. How is it possible that a government half supplied and always necessitous can fulfill the purposes of its institution, can provide for the security, advance the prosperity, or support the reputation of the Commonwealth? So how can a government that doesn't have the money it needs to take care of what it needs to take care of, how can it support the country at large? More questions. How can it ever possess either energy or stability, dignity or credit, confidence at home or respectability abroad? So how is this government really supposed to operate? Again, their favorite word, energy in government, important to remember. Another question. How can its administration be anything else? Oh, two more questions, sorry. How can its administration be anything else than a succession of expedients, temporizing, impotent, disgraceful? So again, how can it not be good? Or how could it work? How will it be able to avoid a frequent sacrifice of its engagements to immediate necessity? So how are we going to do what we have to do? How can it undertake to or execute any liberal or enlarged plans of public good? That's an interesting one. How could an underfunded government possibly do things for the people at large? Again, I know it's easy to reflect today and on the American founding and think that they were very much didn't want the government to do much at all, but Alexander Hamilton did want an energetic government that could do liberal things, classical liberal, not modern liberal, liberal things for the public good. He wanted to invest in the country. He wanted the government to participate in the growth of the economy. He did go on to start the stock exchange. Let us attend to what would be the effects of this situation in the very first war in which we should happen to be engaged. So he's saying, let's look into the future. The United States of America will go to war. It is inevitable. So let's look at what might happen should we not make any changes. We will presume, for argument's sake, that the revenue arising from the impost duties answers the purpose of a provision for the public debt and of a peace establishment for the Union. So let's assume that we're doing what the Anti-Federalists want. We're only collecting money through the import duties. And let's assume that that is enough money to pay for the loans we have to take out to fight the war and to pay for peace. So enough money to fight the war. Thus circumstance, a war breaks out. No, I'm sorry. What he's saying here is enough money to keep the nation going and keep the peace of the Union. And in that situation, a war breaks out. So we need some more money to fight this war. What would be the probable conduct of a government in such an emergency? What do you think the government would do if they don't have money and a war breaks out? Taught by experience that proper dependence could not be placed on the success of requisitions, unable by its own authority to lay hold of fresh resources, and urged by considerations of national danger, would it not be driven to the expedient of diverting the funds already appropriated from their proper objects to the defense of the state? So we know that the Confederation Congress can't really raise money because the states won't pay their share. And therefore there'll be no other way for the Continental Congress to get its hands on any more money. So they're going to have to take the money they have that they're spending on a few things already and take that money away and divert it to the war effort. Is it not easy to see how a step of this kind could be avoided, and if it should be taken, it is evident that it would prove the destruction of public credit at the very moment it was becoming essential to the public safety. So if you take a look at this situation, then first of all, it could be avoided. But if they take this step, then suddenly all the money going to other things are being diverted to the war effort, but they still won't have enough money to fight the war. They will need to take out loans. But demonstrating that they don't have enough money means their credit is bad. The Continental Congress's credit would be bad, as we saw during the Revolutionary War, and therefore the public safety itself is at danger, because that means they won't be able to afford to fight a war properly. To imagine that such a crisis credit might be dispensed with would be the extreme of infatuation. Oh, too long. In the modern system of war, nations, the most wealthy, are obliged to have recourse large loans. So the need for credit is fairly obvious, especially at the time. He says here, even the wealthiest nations in the world, when they went to serious wars, would have to take out loans. When Britain fought France, they would take out loans from either other governments or private companies. A lot of Dutch banks made a lot of money during these wars. And if you don't have the proper credit, no one's going to loan you the money to fight these wars. And if Britain needs to take out credit to fight a war, you better believe you're going to have to take out credit to fight against that same Britain. A country so little opulent as ours might feel this necessity in a much stronger degree. So that's a very nice way of saying a tiny little country called the United States on the global stage definitely understands this. It was a very tiny country at the time. But who would lend to a government that prefaced its overtures for borrowing by an act which demonstrated that no reliance could be placed on the steadiness of its measuring for paying? Who's going to loan the United States money if it can't even pay its own bills? If it needs to take the little money it has going to the little federal projects it has going, and all that money needs to go to the war effort, and it's not nearly enough, who's going to give you a loan? The loans it might be able to procure would be as limited in their extent as burdensome in their conditions. So not only would you get just a little bit of money from loans, but you're going to have crazy high interest rates because you have no other options, which did happen from time to time during the Revolutionary War. They would be made upon the same principle that usurers commonly lend to bankrupt and fraudulent debtors, with a sparing hand and at an enormous premiums. So, as I was saying, you're going to get very little money with a lot of strings attached. Okay. It may perhaps be imagined that, from the scantiness of their resources of the country, the necessity of diverting the established funds in the case supposed would exist, though the national government should possess an unrestrained power of taxation. So because there's so many natural resources in the young United States at the time, you could probably see that we could get the loans, but if we had a national government that could just do whatever, an unrestrained power of taxation, a national government that could tax anything it wanted to at any rate, would be super convenient in this scenario I've laid out for you. But two considerations will serve to quiet all apprehension on this head. So, two things I'm going to say will make you not so worried about this unlimited power of taxation. One is that we are sure the resources of the community in their full extent will be brought into activity for the benefit of the Union. So first of all these resources we have in the United States, well, they're going to come help the United States government. Therefore, we won't have to tax it too much because we're just going to take some of the resources. The other is that whatever deficiencies there may be can without difficulty be supplied by loans. So whatever we can't source ourselves from within, we can source from loans. Because we have the power of taxation, therefore we will get the loans. The power of creating new funds upon new objects of taxation by its own authority would enable the national government to borrow as far as necessary might require. I've got a question here from Wilbur. Thanks for coming, Wilbur. Loans. Why couldn't it ask for loans from states? Wouldn't that encourage the states to be more supportive? That's a great question, Wilbur. Why wouldn't the Continental Congress be able to ask for loans from states? The answer, as Hamilton would give you, is that, well, the Continental Congress was already requesting money from the states that they were supposed to pay. Part of the agreement is apportioned by property and population. The states were supposed to be giving money to the Continental Congress, and they were not. Now, if they weren't just giving the money, if they were loaning the money, you'd think that they might be a little more eager to jump in. And you would think Hamilton largely ignores the idea of patriotism that supported the American Revolution in the first place, and to a degree rightfully so, because you see, by the time the War of 1812 comes around, New England and a lot of the northern states really don't support that particular war and probably wouldn't have paid, which would have caused trouble. And that's essentially one of Hamilton's main arguments that he's getting at here, is that we can't necessarily count on the states to join in the war. Sure, we have our Articles of Confederation, aka Firm League of Friendship, where the states retain their sovereignty, but because they retain their sovereignty doesn't necessarily mean they'll support this League of Friendship, which is essentially a not a peace treaty, but a war treaty. What's the word I'm looking for? A treaty that we will protect each other mutually. But yes, additionally, what you would expect him to call on is private citizens who generally give the loans. You would hope that they would give the loans at a reasonable rate out of patriotism, but that is, as Hamilton's arguing here, that's not always the case. And we do see that during the Revolutionary War. In fact, is it Benjamin? I believe it's Nathaniel Greene. General Nathaniel Greene took out certain loans from private members right after he conquered the South. He needed money, and he took out private loans that he thought would be supported by the Continental Congress, and he essentially did it in Robert Morris's name. He took them out at a very high rate because even though the person loaning the money was a patriot, the Continental had flattened, and most of the wealthy people who were essentially dumping their own money in to back the Continental did not have their money left. It was the end of 1781. It's been years of spending all your money on the Revolutionary War. So there was at least one banker who took out a lot, had relatively high interest rates for Nathaniel Greene. It would actually ruin Nathaniel Greene financially for the remainder of his life, because he wrote it and said, I believe this, thinking that Robert Morris would support him, but he used his name and therefore he owed the money. The guy who loaned him the money passed away. It became a whole thing. It was the financial ruin of an American hero. So simply counting on the generosity of the states or individual citizens or private banks wasn't, any of these people are only going to give you a loan if they think you can pay it back. And Hamilton's main argument here is the Continental Congress has nothing to demonstrate to the world or people within the United States that it could pay it back even if it wanted to. Great question, though. Continuing. The power of creating new funds upon new objects of taxation by its own authority would enable the national government to borrow as far as its necessities might require. So, if the federal government can lay taxes on literally anything at any time in any amount, well, then people who want to give us loans will certainly give us loans. They know we can pay it back. Though, on the flip side, if you can tax absolutely anything at any time, you could just do that instead of taking out loans. But Hamilton likes credit. Foreigners, as well as the citizens of America, could then reasonably repose confidence in its engagements. But to depend on a government that must itself depend on 13 other governments for means of fulfilling its contracts, once its situation is clearly understood, would require a degree of credulity. credulity, not often to be met with in the pecuniary transactions of mankind, and little reconcilable with the usual sharp-sightedness of avarice. A lot of tricky words in there, but essentially he's saying what I just said in response to Wilbur's question. Like, there's not a lot more to add. Yeah, like the Continental Congress does not build the confidence of people paying for its products, or people willing to give it a loan. I guess a better way to put it. Reflections of this kind may have trifling weight with men who hope to see realized in America the halcyon, another word I can't pronounce, scenes of the poetic or fabulous age. But to those who believe we are likely to experience a common portion of the vicissitudes and calamities which have fallen the lot of other nations, they must appear entitled to serious attention. So we got to look around the world at what happens over and over again in other nations to see what we should do ourselves. Such men, in the previous one, he was basically referencing Anti-Federalists. So essentially, Anti-Federalists must behold the actual situation of their country with painful solicitude and depreciate the evils which ambition or revenge might, with too much fallacy, inflict upon it. So Anti-Federalists, all of us, we need to, he calls it painful solicitude, we need to look at reality. Reality might seem terrible. It might be really hard to stomach, but we need to do ourselves a favor and look objectively at what's actually happening to really make the wisest decisions. Publius. It's a fun last little sentence there. I should probably take that to heart nowadays. Bouncing back up here. Hi, I'm Jason. Thank you so much for watching this Federalist Read-Along, Federalist number 30. Quick recap. Sip of water. Excuse me. A lot of reading, a lot of talking. Just to recap real quick. Hamilton in this one moves on from armies and war to taxation, though he does reference war a lot in this particular one, because that's one of his main concerns. And he argues essentially that we need the power to tax under a national government because we need to support not only production within the United States, but we need to be able to support our armies and navies abroad and at home. The Articles of Confederation, the Confederation Congress, as the Continental Congress is usually referenced now, though they still called themselves the Continental Congress at the time, they cannot raise enough money. Everyone knows it. And Anti-Federalists are saying, okay, well, we never had a problem with Great Britain when they taxed imports. Our problems was internal taxation. That should be left up to the states. But the Anti-Federalists said, if you want to tax things that are being imported, great. Hamilton argues, first of all, that's probably not going to be enough money. Second of all, we're never going to be able to, if we need more money, say a war comes up and we need more money, how are we going to get money? Now, most nations take out loans, and that's true. At the time, England, France, all the other nations in the world would take out loans to pay for their wars. But the Articles of Confederation and the Confederation Congress, they can barely raise enough money for themselves. They're not going to give courage to anyone who might loan the money to pay for a new war. So what are they going to do? They're going to be in a terrible situation where they're short on cash and will lose a war. If you can't pay for a war, you're not going to win it. And that is the crux of the argument in Federalist number 30. With that, I do have a few other... one other thing, I see Wilbur throwing out a question, but I know Tarrant asked the other day about Thomas Jefferson and his support for standing armies. I did go back and dig deeper into it just to make sure I was right. And yes, Thomas Jefferson was pretty much against standing armies. He thought that they were one of the more dangerous things to liberty in a republic. When he becomes president, he cuts the size of the army almost in half. Same thing with the Navy. He wanted to rely on militias. He thought it was a person's duty. He believed in a human republic where everyone had a small farm and took care of themselves and maybe sold some stuff on the side to pay property taxes for the community, but it was your duty in that situation, if emergency called for it, to volunteer yourself to join the militia and protect your country. That being said, Madison comes in later and follows suit, wants to reduce the size of the army, but he changes his tune a lot once the War of 1812 is on its way, because Madison supports the War of 1812. He's one of the hawks pushing for it. And then he says, well, maybe we need a little more army. It was a little too late, and it was a very close call. The other thing Jefferson did is when he reduced the size of the army, he got rid of a lot of the officers. Most of the officers were Federalists, having the only person appointing officers to that point were Washington and John Adams, and they were all Federalists. He gets rid of the Federalists and starts bringing in Democratic Republicans. Unfortunately, most of the Federalists, most of the officers and really good soldiers were Federalists the whole time, and therefore he got rid of a lot of the better officers to get in some of the, we'll say, less superb officers, and that was quite troubling during the first few years of the War of 1812. I forget the exact quote, but Winfield Scott, who ends up being a really important leader, commanding officer of the United States Army for several decades, I believe, he ends up more or less saying, like, these guys are terrible. He calls them imbeciles. So I did want to reflect on that, Tarrant. Thomas Jefferson, pretty much against standing armies, though once he took over, it was hard to get rid of him entirely. Wilbur, the Revolution ruined Morris. Why wasn't there an argument for reimbursement for the finances of the Revolution? Why wasn't there an argument for the reimbursement of the finances for the Revolution? You mean in the Federalist Papers or just at large? So, as for Morris, yeah, he was one of the wealthiest people in the future United States when the Revolutionary War breaks out. Really fascinating character. He doesn't support independence, but he does end up signing the Declaration of Independence because he has one of my favorite quotes. Quote, a man should know how to lead. Quote, a man should know how to follow when he cannot lead. It means if you're outvoted in a democracy, you don't just grab some tissues and cry about it and take your ball and go home. You're part of the team, and you need to support the team even if you disagree with the moves being made. So he stays around, signs the Declaration. He's one of the few people from Pennsylvania who doesn't support independence but still gets to stick around for a while. It's really important because he's known as the financier of the Revolution, as you may very well know. He helped create the Continental. He continuously found ways to pay for this money. One of Hamilton's really arguments in Federalist number 30 is we can't rely on people like Robert Morris, because we're not always going to have a man as great as Robert Morris around to find this money for us to pay for it. Now, did the Revolution itself ruin Robert Morris? No. He lost a lot of money. But he had so much money in the first place that's not actually what ruined him. He had lost so much money during the war that after the Revolutionary War ended, in the second half of the 1780s, everyone starts speculating because suddenly all this new land is available to us. We just won this land. Are there Native Americans? Yeah, well, they won't be there for long. They'll move out. Yeah. We all know the sad story of Native American history in America. And many founders invested a lot of money in land. Robert Morris is one of these people who took his much diminished fortune, but still pretty much a fortune. Again, you're not the financier of the American Revolution if you're not good with money. And if you're good with money, you're not going to spend all your money on the Revolution. So he took the money he had left. He invested it in land speculation. It did not work out. And he is one of the first people to go. He actually ends up going to debtor's prison, mostly on the money he invested in land speculation. And the first bankruptcy laws in the United States were essentially written to get Robert Morris out of jail because we can't have him in jail. Even though there were many other founders, really important ones, who went to jail. Names are eluding me right now. I want to say James Wilson. I don't want to slander James Wilson if that's not the right name. But I believe it was him. William Blount, who was a major founder of Tennessee, really contributed to the rise of Andrew Jackson as a politician, a signer of the a signer of the United States Constitution. He ends up dying essentially in poverty, dying on the run, for similar reasons, just land speculation investments, because the land market collapsed, especially in 1791, right after Hamilton puts together his financial plan. It does not go well. He's selling securities and bonds, and you need to have a certain amount of, again, I'm not an economist, but you need to have a certain amount of securities to pay for the bonds, or vice versa. And then some, William Dewar and I think it's Meekum tried to corner the market on the bonds, and then it turns out they had lost all their money in land speculation, and like the panic of 1791 occurs, and like right on the beginning of the United States, the economy almost collapses. Hamilton finds a way to save this because his friends that he's starting a bank with, one of the banks he started, he goes to them, he goes to the bank, Bank of North America, which was in Pennsylvania, and he essentially has these banks kind of stall their payments for a little bit. Again, economics is very difficult for all of us to understand, but he does like really high level economic maneuvering and Hamilton staves off the first real serious depression, which would have probably killed the United States in its infancy. So like, while I do talk a little bit of trash about Hamilton on this, he does some really impressive things to help win the create the United States. And of course, he is a hero at the Battle of Yorktown. So I never want to forget that either. A few more questions. Thanks for reading and discussing in the tax discussion. Sorry, yeah. Why didn't Hamilton say something about Morse? In this particular paper, he's not really calling out individuals in this paper. Also, pointing to someone like Robert Morris, who does step up when you need him to, and would give loans to the like. You think the Continental Congress under the Articles of Confederation was bad? You should have seen the Continental Congress when there was no government tying it together, and it was just a bunch of dudes sent from the separate states hanging out in Philadelphia trying to figure it out. And Robert Morris stepped up, and it's interesting you note that Hamilton doesn't point that out, that he doesn't think people will step up, which time and again in American history people actually have. Not only him, and I'm getting way off topic here, but Morgan, the name escapes me. Is it Andrew Carnegie? Sorry, I believe it's Andrew Carnegie stepped up during the Depression of. So there were a lot of what they called panics back then, before they created the Internal Revenue Service and the 17th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. And whatever your opinion of that is, there was I think it was 1893, there was another panic, and the United States of America went bankrupt. And Andrew Carnegie said, I made all this money because this is the greatest nation in the world. And were I not have the opportunity to make all this money, I would not be the person I am. And Carnegie pays for the American debt. He literally says he had more money than the United States of America, which sounds crazy, but like we have a bunch of trillionaires today, or billionaires going on trillionaires, who actually have more money than the United States government. And the United States was going to dissolve, like declare bankruptcy and give up. And he stepped up and paid for it. So say what you will about the fat cats. And then in, I think it was 1907, it happened again. Now, he didn't step up alone this time, but Carnegie went and hooked up with, essentially, he got Teddy Roosevelt to permit him to monopolize another company under his umbrella to save that company and therefore save the economy of the United States. And I'm getting way off topic here, but we may not love income taxes because things have changed over the course of 100 years. But the reason the 17th Amendment was put through and the reason the IRS was originally created was to... Andrew Carnegie literally went to the federal government and said, I'm not going to live forever. Much like Hamilton was saying, do you think there's going to be another me to bail you out next time? Or will that person be too greedy to just donate hundreds of millions of dollars to help you out? And that was actually the argument. I have read The Creature from Jekyll Island, and I know that there are certain conspiracies about, just a bunch of rich people trying to take our money. That was not the original intention of the Internal Revenue Service. The original intention of the Internal Revenue Service was to tax the ultra wealthy. In fact, from the inception of the Internal Revenue Service until 1971, only the top 5% of earners had an income tax, and they were taxed at 90%. I know that sounds crazy, but look it up. With the exception of World War II, where there was an emergency income tax on general population, 95% of Americans didn't pay any income tax. And the top 5% paid most of their money. Because that was the original intention. It was the richest who have succeeded the most in this country should want to step up and help take care of the country that took care of them. I've gotten, again, way off topic. This is not the type of history we usually discuss here at Founder of the Day, but it's a really interesting point. And unfortunately, it's from the 1970s on that we'll just put it, we'll leave it at this. It's not just the top 5% that pays income tax anymore, and the top 5% doesn't pay nearly close to the 90% that they did for most of the history of the Internal Revenue Service. So, Troy coming with a question. AMREV is full of the right person at the right place and the right time stepping up, military and political sides. Troy, that's a great point. It's one of the really fascinating things about the American Revolution. Like, objectively, if you look at history, they should not have won that war. But from time to time, the right person in the right place came in and helped win the revolution. You know, there's so many stories of people doing kind of random things that really help. You know, I mean, the first one that comes to my mind is hero of the revolution, Benedict Arnold, who comes in at Saratoga at just the right time. And while we're not exactly sure exactly what he said or did at that time, but he does hit the battlefield and he does inspire the men. You know, you have George Washington giving his Newburgh speech and, you know, saying, we're not going to have a dictatorship in this country. No thanks. We're not going to have the military walk on the Capitol. We're not going to be that kind of nation. I mean, I could spout examples over and over again, as you can imagine. You have Alexander Hamilton finally getting his command and taking the redoubt at Yorktown. Makes one think seriously of Providence. I believe what Matt's referencing is Providence, is how they referenced it in the Declaration, with a firm reliance on divine providence. Your spiritual beliefs, the idea that there is a maker who might take care of us when we are righteous, I believe is what Troy is getting at there. It's obviously, I got a whole life dedicated to the American Revolution, so I don't need to elaborate how it's the most fascinating period of time. People fighting for like freedom and equality, and of course, you know, there are great hypocrisy arguments about that freedom and equality, but it's the foundation. For me, it's the foundation in the Declaration of Independence. It's the ideals. It's not like, hey, here's what's true right now. It's like, hey, here's what should be true, and let's make this happen. And, you know, the great train of American history has, with certain major setbacks, been that attempting those achievements. The ideals in the Declaration of Independence are so lofty and high, they'll probably never be achieved, but they are worth fighting for, and they are worth striving for. And that's what's so much fun about the period of time that we like to discuss here on Founder of the Day. And with that, we've gotten wildly off topic. So I will go. Now, I do want to say a few things. I need to apologize to you guys. I promised a bunch of videos over the past weekend. March is the toughest month for my family because my spouse, who usually works essentially out of her car across central New York, March, she goes away for several days every week. Random days. Sometimes it's 3 nights, sometimes it's 1 night. And we got our books confused and she was gone for a portion of last weekend. That being said, this weekend, I've already created my Lee family tree, which I will be recording live on my Patreon channel tomorrow. Also, we're going to do an Anti-Federalist read-along on the Patreon channel. The Lee family tree I will put out for the general public. I'm not sure how long I'm going to hold on to the Anti-Federalist read-along. We're starting new Anti-Federalist tomorrow, so if you do want to support the channel, get a little bit of extra content, tomorrow we're doing that. Check out the link below. I do appreciate that. And if you have not hit like, please hit like. That's the kindest thing you can do for the channel. On top of that, we're going to go back to Friday for trivia this week. We're going to trivia on Friday. It's going to be sweet. We get a better crowd usually on Fridays. I had moved trivia to Thursdays because I was in a bowling league on Fridays, but now my bowling league's on Monday. I just threw my new high score for the season, a 189 last night. It was very impressive for me, even if it's not for you. Yes, hopefully you can make it Friday, Troy. Fridays seem to be better for everyone, even though people generally have things to do on Friday. They also can stay up later and ignore their responsibilities the following morning. There is a bunch more stuff I know. Okay, also the treason video. I started setting up the treason video. I've put hours of work into the treason video. There is a lot more treason in the United States in the American Revolution than I realized. So I have to cut the list down to make it a reasonable video. So look forward to that. I'm not sure, probably sometime this weekend, but I'm not entirely sure what day. With that, thank you guys so much for your support. I see some of you threw me some likes over there. You are very generous with your time and your thumbs ups. I am your humble and obedient servant, and I will be back with more American Revolution all week long.